The gavel struck the table so hard that Eleanor Whitmore flinched as though she had been the one to fall. Her father was not yet cold in his grave, and already the drawing room at Ashford Hollow had become a courtroom of whispers. The family solicitor, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, cleared his throat and unrolled a second document beside her father's will. Eleanor did not recognize it. She had never seen it before in her life, and yet there it was, bearing her father's signature at the bottom, dated only weeks before his death. "A codicil," the solicitor said, his voice apologetic but firm, "discovered among the late Baron's private papers. It names Mr. Reginald Whitmore as sole heir to the estate and title of Ashford Hollow." The room went very still. Eleanor's aunt, Lady Constance, rose so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor. "That is impossible," she said. "Impossible, and you know it is impossible, Mr. Price." Mr. Aldous Price did not look impossible. He looked calm, almost bored, as if he had expected this exact reaction and had already decided it did not matter. He folded his hands and glanced toward the man standing near the window, the man Eleanor had grown up calling cousin, though they had not spoken in nearly 10 years. Reginald Whitmore did not smile. He was too careful a man to smile in front of witnesses, but there was something in the way he held himself, shoulders back, chin lifted, that told Eleanor he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "I am sorry it comes to this, Eleanor," he said, and his voice was smooth as poured wax. "Truly, but the law is the law. A woman cannot inherit a title. You know this as well as I do." "The law also does not permit forged documents," Lady Constance snapped. "Forged?" Reginald's eyebrows lifted in practiced surprise. "That is a serious accusation, Aunt. One I hope you can prove, because I intend to bring this matter before the courts within the week, and I would hate for you to repeat such a claim in front of a magistrate without evidence to support it." Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her, though she had not moved at all. She thought of her father, of the quiet mornings they had spent walking the gardens together, of the way he had always told her that Ashford Hollow would be hers to protect one day, that she carried the family's name in her hands the way other people carried candles through a dark house, carefully, so the flame would not go out. Now a stranger's signature threatened to blow that flame out entirely, and the stranger was not even a stranger. He was blood. That made it worse. "I want to see the document," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Mr. Price slid the paper toward her without hesitation, which frightened her more than any refusal would have. A guilty man hides his evidence. A confident man hands it over, because he already believes he has won. Her father's signature looked correct. The ink was the right shade of black, the slant of the letters matched the way he always wrote his W. But something in her chest refused to accept it, a small, stubborn voice that said her father would never have done this, not to her, not without telling her himself. "He would have spoken to me," Eleanor said quietly. "If he meant to change everything, he would have told me himself." "Grief makes people believe many things," Reginald said, not unkindly, which was somehow crueler than if he had been cruel. "I understand this is difficult to hear." Lady Constance took Eleanor's arm and steered her toward the door before Eleanor could say anything else, before the tears building behind her eyes could fall in front of the man trying to take everything from her. Outside in the corridor, away from Price and Reginald, Lady Constance's composure cracked at last. "That signature is false," she whispered fiercely. "Your father hated Reginald. He would sooner have left Ashford Hollow to the church than to that man." "Then how do we prove it?" Eleanor asked. "I have no standing in court. I am a woman. Reginald knows that better than anyone. He chose this moment because he knows I cannot fight him alone." "Then we find someone who can stand where you cannot," Lady Constance said. Eleanor did not know yet who that someone would be. She only knew that within a week, her home, her name, and everything her father had built would be decided by men in a courtroom who had never known her father at all, who would look only at ink and paper and never at the truth sitting quietly beneath it. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her father's study, surrounded by the ledgers and letters he had kept so carefully organized. She searched through every drawer, every locked box she could find the key to, hoping for some record that would contradict the codicil, some proof that her father's final wishes had never included his nephew. She found nothing. Reginald and Price had been thorough. By the time the candle burned low, Eleanor understood something that frightened her more than the thought of losing the house itself. She understood that being right was not enough. In a world built by men, for men, being right without power meant nothing at all. The court date was set for a fortnight later, and the case, as such things often did among the titled families of London, did not remain quiet for long. Whispers moved through drawing rooms and ballrooms faster than any carriage could travel. By the end of the week, Eleanor could feel the eyes on her whenever she stepped outside, could hear the way conversations dropped into silence when she entered a room. She had lost her father. Now, it seemed, she was expected to lose everything else as well, quietly, and without complaint. Lady Constance insisted they attend a small gathering at the home of an old family friend, arguing that hiding away would only make Eleanor look guilty of something, though guilty of what, no one could quite say. Eleanor did not want to go. She wanted to sit in the study and search the ledgers again, as if the answer might appear on the 100th reading when it had not appeared on the first 99. But she went, because Lady Constance was right about one thing: disappearing would only feed the whispers. It was there, in a crowded room full of polite smiles and careful cruelty, that Eleanor first truly noticed the Duke of Renwick. She had heard his name before, of course. Julian Ashcombe was not a man easily overlooked, though he seemed to make every effort to be exactly that. He stood near the edge of the room, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, watching the crowd with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply observant, as though he were reading a room the way other men read a ledger. Their eyes met only briefly. He did not approach her, and she did not expect him to. Dukes did not concern themselves with the private disputes of minor baronial families, whatever gossip said about the matter. And yet, as Eleanor turned away, she caught him watching Reginald across the room with an expression she could not quite name. Not curiosity. Something closer to suspicion. She thought little of it at the time. She had far greater troubles pressing on her than the passing glance of a duke she had never spoken to and likely never would. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong for another few days yet. The following morning, a letter arrived at Ashford Hollow, addressed not to Lady Constance, but to Eleanor herself. The handwriting was unfamiliar, precise and unhurried. She opened it at the breakfast table, expecting perhaps another cruelty from Reginald, another warning dressed as sympathy. Instead, the letter was brief and signed only with a single initial. It requested, with careful formality, a private audience regarding a matter of some importance to her current circumstances. The letter was signed J. Eleanor read it 3 times before she understood who had sent it, and when she did, her hands went still against the table. She did not know why a duke would take any interest in her ruin. She did not know whether to hope, after everything, that his interest meant help, or whether it meant something far more complicated. But for the first time since the reading of the will, she felt something other than despair settle in her chest. It was small and uncertain, and she was almost afraid to name it. It felt, very quietly, like the beginning of a chance. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her dress, and began to write her reply before she could talk herself out of it. Whatever the Duke wanted, whatever price his help might carry, she had run out of other options, and out of time. The court date drew closer with every passing hour, and Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of a house about to lose its name, decided she would not go into that courtroom without at least trying every door left open to her, even one guarded by a duke whose reasons she did not yet understand. She spent the rest of that morning turning the letter over in her mind, searching each careful word for some hidden meaning. Dukes did not write to ruined baronial daughters without reason, and Eleanor was not foolish enough to believe kindness alone had moved his hand. Something else had caught his attention, something she could not yet see. Lady Constance read the letter twice before setting it down on the table with a thoughtful frown. "Renwick," she said slowly. "I remember his father, a hard man but an honest one. If the son takes after him, this may be worth more than we dare hope. Or it may be nothing at all," Eleanor said, "a curious man passing an idle hour." "Dukes do not write letters over idle hours," Lady Constance replied. "Not to families they have no cause to notice." "He noticed something, Eleanor. The question is what?" Eleanor thought again of the look she had caught on his face the night before, the way his gaze had followed Reginald across the crowded room, sharp and unreadable. She wondered now if she had imagined the suspicion in it, or if she had simply been too consumed by her own troubles to recognize what it truly meant. She sent her reply before the hour was out, agreeing to receive him the following afternoon, and then spent the remainder of the day trying to occupy her hands with tasks that could not quiet her mind. She walked the gardens her father had loved, past the roses he had planted the year she was born, past the bench where he used to sit with his morning correspondence. Every corner of Ashford Hollow held some memory of him, and every memory now felt like something she might soon be forced to leave behind. Reginald had not visited the house since the reading of the will, but his presence lingered anyway, in the servants who no longer met her eyes, in the tenants who whispered when they thought she could not hear. A house did not need its enemy inside its walls to feel occupied by him. That evening, as the sun dropped low behind the hills, Eleanor sat once more in her father's study and allowed herself, for the first time since his death, to weep without restraint. Not for the estate, not for the title, but for the simple, unbearable fact that he was gone, and that she had been left to fight a battle he should have warned her was coming. When the tears finally passed, something steadier settled in their place. Grief did not leave her, but it made room, just barely, for resolve. Her father had taught her to protect this house. He had never taught her to surrender it without a fight, and she did not intend to start now, whatever the law said about what a woman could or could not do. She rose from the desk, straightened her shoulders the way she had seen her father do before difficult conversations, and began to prepare for whatever the Duke of Renwick intended to say to her. The knock at the door came precisely at the hour promised, not a minute before or after, and Eleanor found herself oddly comforted by that precision, as though a man who respected time might also respect truth. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Renwick, entered the drawing room with none of the arrogance she had braced herself for. He was tall, composed, dressed simply for a man of his rank, and he bowed to her with the same careful courtesy he might have shown a woman of far higher station. Lady Constance remained in the room as chaperone, seated near the window with her embroidery, though Eleanor suspected she was listening far more closely than she was stitching. "Thank you for receiving me," Julian said. "I imagine my letter raised more questions than it answered." "It did," Eleanor said. "I am still uncertain why a duke would concern himself with my family's troubles." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her for a moment, the same considering look she had noticed across the crowded room the night before. "I attended the gathering last evening because an old friend insisted, and I confess I found little of interest in it, until I overheard your cousin speaking with Mr. Price near the terrace. They did not know I was close enough to hear them." Eleanor's chest tightened. "What did they say?" "Very little that would satisfy a magistrate," Julian admitted. "Men like your cousin are careful with their words, even in private. But enough was said to trouble me." Reginald referred to the codicil as fortunate timing, not fortunate discovery. Fortunate timing. "Those are not the same thing, Miss Whitmore, and I do not believe the difference was an accident of speech." Lady Constance's needle stopped moving entirely. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach, confirmation of a suspicion she had carried since the reading of the will, but had not dared to fully trust, because trusting it changed nothing without proof. "You believe the document was forged?" "I believe it deserves closer examination than it has received," Julian said carefully. "I am not in the habit of making accusations I cannot support, but I have some experience with legal matters, and I have connections among men who understand documents and signatures better than most magistrates ever will. If you are willing, I would like to look into this further, quietly, before the court date arrives." "Why?" Eleanor asked, because the question had been sitting on her tongue since she opened his letter. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but you have no obligation to my family. Whatever you overheard, you could simply have said nothing and continued with your evening." Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of old memory that he did not immediately explain. "Because I know what it is to watch a family's name threatened by men who believe themselves untouchable," he said. "My own father spent the better part of a decade defending our title against a cousin who believed forged papers and confident lies were enough to take what was not his. My father won, eventually, but the cost of that fight nearly destroyed him before it was finished. I do not offer my help lightly, Miss Whitmore. I offer it because I recognize the shape of what is happening to you, and I have no intention of watching it happen unchallenged while I have the means to prevent it." The room was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor studied his face, searching for the practiced sympathy she had grown so used to hearing from Reginald, the kind that meant nothing beneath its polished surface. She did not find it. What she found instead was something steadier, something that looked, strangely, like resolve. "What would you need from me?" she asked. "Access to any correspondence your father kept in the months before his death. Letters, ledgers, anything with his handwriting that might allow comparison against the codicil. And your discretion. If Reginald or Price learns I am investigating this before I have proof, they will have time to cover whatever tracks remain." Eleanor rose and crossed to the study door without hesitation, gesturing for him to follow. Lady Constance rose as well, setting her embroidery aside at last, though she said nothing, watching the two of them with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. The study still held the disorder of Eleanor's own search from days before, ledgers stacked unevenly, letters spread across the desk where she had left them in exhaustion. Julian moved through the room with quiet efficiency, examining documents with a careful eye, occasionally holding 2 pages side by side toward the window light. "Your father's hand," he said after a long while, was heavier on his downstrokes than the signature on the codicil. Here and here. He set 2 letters beside her for comparison, and Eleanor leaned closer, her breath catching as she saw what he meant. The difference was subtle, easy to miss unless one was looking for it deliberately, but it was there. "Is that enough?" she asked, hope rising in her chest for the first time in days. "Not yet," Julian said. "A magistrate will want more than my observation and yours. We need a man whose profession is examining documents for forgery, someone whose testimony cannot be dismissed as bias or friendship. I know of such a man in London. I intend to visit him myself, quietly, and bring him whatever samples of your father's true hand we can gather." Eleanor nodded, gathering letters with steadier hands than she had managed in days. For the first time since the reading of the will, she felt something other than helplessness. She felt, cautiously, like a woman with allies instead of enemies. Before he left that afternoon, Julian paused at the door, his expression softening slightly from the careful formality he had worn throughout the visit. "I should warn you, Miss Whitmore. If your cousin learns of my involvement, he will not take it quietly. Men like Reginald do not simply accept exposure. They fight it, often by turning attention away from their own guilt and toward whatever weakness they can find in their opponent." "What weakness would he find in me?" Eleanor asked. "Perhaps none," Julian said, "but he may try to find one in me instead, to discourage my involvement. I ask that you be prepared for whatever rumors may follow, and that you trust they are exactly that, rumors, and nothing more." Eleanor did not fully understand his warning until 3 days later, when whispers began moving through London drawing rooms that the Duke of Renwick had taken a sudden and improper interest in a ruined baron's daughter, whispers that grew more elaborate with each retelling, until the story bore little resemblance to the truth at all. She wanted to write to him immediately, to apologize for whatever damage her family's troubles had brought to his reputation, but Lady Constance stopped her before she could finish the letter. "He knew this would happen," Lady Constance said. "He warned you himself. Do not insult the man by assuming he cannot bear the consequences of his own choices." Eleanor set the letter aside, though the worry did not leave her so easily. She had asked him why he offered his help, and he had given her an honest answer. But she had not asked what it might cost him to give it, and now, watching the whispers spread like smoke through every room she entered, she began to understand that the price might be higher than either of them had first imagined. The whispers reached Reginald faster than Eleanor expected. She learned this firsthand when she encountered him outside a milliner's shop on a gray afternoon, his expression carrying none of the practiced warmth he had shown at the reading of the will. For the first time since her father's death, she saw something honest in his face, and what she saw was irritation. "I hear the Duke of Renwick has taken quite an interest in your affairs," he said, falling into step beside her, though she had given him no invitation to do so. "How fortunate for you. Though I wonder what a man of his standing truly wants from a family about to lose everything of value." "Perhaps he simply dislikes forgery," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady, though her heart beat faster than she liked. Something flickered across Reginald's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. A strong word, forgery. "I would be careful how you use it, Eleanor, and careful whom you allow to use it on your behalf. Accusations without proof have a way of damaging the accuser far more than the accused." "Then it should trouble you very little," Eleanor replied, "since you have assured everyone the codicil is genuine." Reginald's jaw tightened, the first true crack she had seen in his composure since this ordeal began. "I have no wish to see you humiliated further than you already will be, cousin. The court will rule as the law dictates, whatever games your duke chooses to play beforehand. I would advise you to prepare yourself for that outcome, rather than placing your hope in a man who will lose interest the moment the matter becomes inconvenient." He left her standing outside the shop without another word, and Eleanor stood there a long moment, watching his carriage disappear down the street, turning his warning over in her mind. It was the closest thing to fear she had seen from him yet, buried beneath layers of confidence, but present all the same. Men who believed themselves entirely safe did not offer warnings. They simply waited to win. She wrote to Julian that evening, describing the encounter in careful detail, uncertain whether the information would matter to his investigation, or simply serve as another small piece of the larger picture he was assembling. His reply arrived the following morning, brief but reassuring, telling her that Reginald's agitation was, if anything, a favorable sign. Guilty men rarely remained calm when their schemes began to unravel, however slowly. Eleanor found herself reading his letters more than once, not merely for the information they carried, but for the steadiness of the hand that had written them, a steadiness she had come to rely on more than she wished to admit, given how briefly she had known him. She reminded herself, more than once, that his involvement in her case was a matter of principle, nothing more, and that she ought not allow herself to hope for anything beyond his help in the courtroom. But the reminder grew harder to believe each time a new letter arrived, each time she found herself watching for his handwriting among the Morning Post before she had even finished her tea. Lady Constance noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "You are fond of him," she said one evening, not as an accusation, simply as an observation offered over their embroidery. "I am grateful to him," Eleanor corrected. "Those are not always different things," Lady Constance said, and returned to her stitching without further comment, leaving Eleanor to sit with the truth of that statement far longer than she intended. 2 days later, a note arrived from Julian, brief and steady as his letters always were. He had found the man in London whose profession was examining documents, and the man had agreed to review the samples. It would take time, Julian wrote, but he believed they would have an answer before the court date arrived. Eleanor read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it with the first letter he had sent her, a small collection of steady handwriting, in the middle of a world that had grown increasingly unsteady beneath her feet. She did not yet know how the investigation would end, or what it might cost either of them before the truth was finally proven. But for the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to believe that the truth might actually be found, and that she would not have to face the courtroom entirely alone. That night, sleep came slowly, her mind circling between fear and something gentler she was still reluctant to name. She thought of her father, of how carefully he had built the life she was now fighting to keep, and she wondered what he would make of the Duke who had stepped so unexpectedly into the middle of her troubles. She liked to think he would have approved, that he would have recognized in Julian the same quiet steadiness he had always valued in the few men he trusted. She thought too of Reginald's warning outside the milliner's shop, the way his composure had cracked just enough to reveal the fear beneath it. A man who felt truly safe would not have bothered to threaten her at all. He would have simply smiled, confident in his victory, and walked on without a second glance. Instead, he had lingered, had pressed his warning further than necessary, and Eleanor understood now that this was not the behavior of a man who believed the codicil was genuine. It was the behavior of a man watching his own lie begin to unravel beneath him, and growing desperate to hold the threads together before anyone else noticed them fraying. She rose before dawn the next morning, unable to remain in bed any longer, and spent the early hours reviewing her father's ledgers once more, searching now not for proof of forgery, which Julian had already begun to secure, but for anything that might explain why Reginald had chosen this particular moment to strike. Grief made people vulnerable, she realized. Reginald had understood that better than anyone, had waited until she was at her weakest to make his claim, certain that sorrow alone would keep her from fighting back. He had underestimated her. He had also, she was beginning to believe, underestimated the Duke who had chosen, for reasons of his own, to stand beside her when it would have been far easier to stand aside. The court date grew closer with each passing day, and Eleanor found herself caught between dread and a fragile, stubborn hope, uncertain which feeling would win by the time she finally stood before the magistrate to learn her family's fate. The document examiner's office sat above a bookshop on a narrow London street, and Julian arrived there before the sun had fully risen, unwilling to waste another day while Reginald's confidence grew unchecked. The examiner, a precise older man named Mr. Fenwick, had spent 30 years studying handwriting for the courts, and he greeted Julian with the same careful attention he gave to every document that crossed his desk. He laid the samples side by side beneath a strong lamp, comparing Eleanor's father's true correspondence against the contested codicil, murmuring quietly to himself as he worked. "The pressure is wrong," Fenwick said finally, tapping the codicil with one thin finger. "See here, along the descenders of the letters, genuine handwriting varies naturally, even within a single document, because the hand tires and shifts as it writes. This signature is too consistent, too careful. It has the look of something copied slowly from a model, rather than written in one uninterrupted motion." "Would that satisfy a magistrate?" Julian asked. "It would raise a question," Fenwick said. "Whether it satisfies him depends on how well the question is asked, and how much the other side is prepared to argue against it. I can prepare a written opinion, but I would recommend more. If there is any way to determine who actually held the pen, that would serve you better than my analysis alone." Julian left the office with the written opinion tucked carefully inside his coat, but Fenwick's final words stayed with him longer than the document itself. Analysis alone would not be enough. Reginald and Price had prepared their case with the same careful patience they had used to construct the forgery in the first place, And a written opinion, however credible, could be challenged, delayed, or dismissed by a determined opponent with resources of his own. He needed a witness, someone who had seen the forgery take shape, or who could speak to Price's methods with first-hand knowledge that no amount of clever argument could easily dismiss. It took him 3 more days of careful, discreet inquiry before he found what he needed, in the unlikely form of a young clerk named Edmund Fairfax, who had worked briefly in Price's office before being dismissed for reasons the solicitor had never fully explained. Julian found him working now in a modest shop near the docks, his hands stained with ink of a very different kind, and approached him not as a duke demanding cooperation, but as a man asking honestly for help. "I know what he asked me to do," Edmund admitted quietly, after Julian had explained the situation without pressure or threat, simply laying out what he knew and what he needed. "I refused, and he dismissed me for it within the week, though he gave some other excuse to the rest of the office. I did not think anyone would believe me if I spoke of it. Men like Price have a way of making certain they are believed over men like me." "I believe you," Julian said, "and I intend to make certain a magistrate believes you as well." Edmund hesitated, glancing toward the shop window as though Price himself might be watching from the street. "There will be consequences, Your Grace. If I testify against him, I will lose whatever standing I have left in this city. Men like Price have long memories." "There will be consequences either way," Julian said honestly. "If you say nothing, an innocent woman loses her home and her name to a lie you know to be false. I cannot force you to testify, and I would not ask you to risk everything without acknowledging what that risk truly means. But I can promise you this. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you will not stand alone afterward. I look after those who help me." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, turning the offer over with the same careful consideration Julian had come to recognize as a mark of an honest man weighing a difficult choice. Finally, he nodded, slow and resolute. "I will testify," he said. "Eleanor Whitmore's father was kind to me once, years ago, when I was a boy running errands near Ashford Hollow. I would rather lose my position twice over than watch his daughter lose everything, because I was too afraid to speak the truth." Julian left the shop with something he had not expected to find so easily, an ally with a conscience and a memory sharper than Price had likely accounted for. He returned to his own townhouse that evening feeling, for the first time since he had begun this investigation, that the truth might genuinely prevail. He found Eleanor waiting for him the following afternoon in her father's study, and though propriety demanded he keep his visits brief and properly chaperoned, Lady Constance had grown accustomed enough to his presence by now that she allowed them a measure of quiet privacy near the window, while she busied herself elsewhere in the room. "You found something," Eleanor said, reading it in his expression before he had spoken a single word. He told her everything: Fenwick's analysis, the inconsistencies in the pressure and pacing of the forged signature, and finally, Edmund Fairfax's willingness to testify against his former employer. Eleanor listened with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression shifting from cautious hope to something closer to disbelief as the full weight of what he had gathered settled over her. "He truly agreed to speak against Price," she said, knowing what it would cost him. "He remembered your father's kindness," Julian said. "It seems your family has earned more loyalty than Reginald accounted for when he began this scheme." Eleanor's eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears back before they could fall. "I do not know how to thank you for this. You have risked your own reputation, spent your own time and connections, for a family you barely knew a fortnight ago." "I did not do this for gratitude," Julian said, his voice quieter now, softer than the careful formality he usually maintained. "I did it because it was right, and because I could not stand by and watch a lie succeed simply because it wore the trappings of legality. But if you wish to know the truth, Eleanor, there is more to it than principle alone. I find myself, against every intention I carried into this matter, thinking of you far more often than a man in my position ought to think of anyone." The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of Lady Constance's needlework across the room, a silence that stretched long enough for Eleanor to feel her own heartbeat in her ears. "I did not expect you to say such a thing," she admitted quietly. "Neither did I," Julian said, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him since they had met. "I am not a man given to impulsive declarations, Miss Whitmore. I have spent most of my life guarding my words as carefully as my family's name. But I find that guarding them around you has become considerably more difficult than I anticipated." Eleanor did not know how to answer him, caught between the fragile hope building around her father's case and the equally fragile, equally frightening hope building somewhere in her own chest. She settled, finally, for honesty. "I have thought of you as well, she said, more than I intended to admit, even to myself. Whatever might have followed that admission was interrupted by the sound of the front door below, hurried footsteps on the stairs, and Lady Constance's sharp intake of breath as a servant appeared in the doorway, breathless and pale. "Mr. Price is here," the servant said. "He insists on speaking with you at once, Miss Whitmore. He says it concerns the court date." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Julian, the warmth of the previous moment giving way quickly to wariness. Price did not make unannounced visits without purpose, and given how carefully he and Reginald had guarded their scheme thus far, an unannounced visit now suggested something had changed, and not in Eleanor's favor. They found Price waiting in the drawing room, his composure intact but something tighter around his eyes than Eleanor had seen before. "I thought it only fair to inform you directly," he said, without preamble, "that Mr. Whitmore has filed an additional motion with the court, questioning the propriety of the Duke of Renwick's involvement in this matter." "On what grounds?" Julian asked, his voice carefully level. "On the grounds that a duke's personal interest in a young unmarried woman's affairs raises questions about impartiality," Price said. "The motion suggests that whatever evidence you present may be tainted by improper motive, and requests the court disregard any testimony gathered through your involvement." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her once more, the same sickening drop she had felt at the reading of the will. "That is absurd," she said. "The evidence stands on its own merit, regardless of who gathered it." "Absurd or not," Price said with the faint, satisfied edge of a man delivering bad news he had helped engineer, "the motion has been filed, and the magistrate will need to consider it before the case proceeds. I thought it courteous to warn you both, given how close the court date has grown." He left as abruptly as he had arrived, and the drawing room fell into a heavy silence once he was gone. Eleanor turned to Julian, searching his face for reassurance she was not certain he could offer. "Can they truly dismiss the evidence?" she asked. "They can attempt to delay it," Julian said, his jaw tight with restrained anger. "Reginald is growing desperate, Eleanor. A confident man does not need to attack the credibility of his opponent's evidence. He attacks it only when he fears what that evidence will prove." "Desperate men are dangerous," Lady Constance said quietly from her chair, "especially when they have as much to lose as Reginald does." Julian nodded slowly, already turning the problem over in his mind. "Then we will need to move more carefully than before, and more quickly. I will speak with my own solicitor this evening about countering the motion. Whatever Reginald intends, I do not believe he has considered exactly how far I am willing to go to see this matter through to its proper end." Eleanor watched him leave that evening with a heart full of contradictions, gratitude and fear tangled together so tightly she could not separate one from the other. The case had grown more complicated, more dangerous, and yet she found herself, despite everything, unwilling to face any of it without the Duke of Renwick standing beside her. Whatever Reginald intended next, she understood now that he was no longer fighting a grieving, isolated woman with no means to defend herself. He was fighting a partnership, forged in the space of a fortnight, that neither he nor Price had fully anticipated when they first set their scheme into motion. Julian's own solicitor, a measured man named Mr. Ellery who had handled the Renwick family's affairs for over a decade, received the news of Reginald's motion with far less alarm than Eleanor had expected when Julian relayed it to him the following morning. "Motions of this kind rarely succeed on their own merit," Ellery said, studying the filed papers with the unhurried patience of a man who had seen 100 such tactics before. "They are designed to delay and distract, not to win outright. Your cousin's solicitor is gambling that the accusation alone will plant doubt in the magistrate's mind, regardless of whether the doubt is fair. Our task is simply to ensure Justice Harlan sees the motion for what it is." "And what is it?" Julian asked. "A desperate man's attempt to discredit evidence he cannot otherwise refute," Ellery said. "I will prepare a response emphasizing that your involvement began only after independent observation of suspicious behavior, not before, and that the evidence gathered stands independently of any personal interest you may or may not hold in the matter. Mr. Fenwick's analysis and Mr. Fairfax's testimony will speak for themselves, regardless of who first brought them to light." Eleanor listened to this exchange from her seat near the window, grateful for Ellery's calm even as her own nerves remained stretched thin. She thought of Reginald's face outside the milliner's shop, the crack in his composure she had mistaken, perhaps, for simple irritation rather than genuine fear. She understood now that she had been right to notice it. A man confident in his position did not need to attack his opponent's motives. He attacked only when the ground beneath his own claim had begun to crumble. That evening, as Eleanor walked the gardens at Ashford Hollow, trying to settle the restless energy that had followed her since Price's visit, She found Reginald waiting near the old stone bench where her father used to read his correspondence each morning. She had not invited him, and his presence there, in the one corner of the garden most tied to her father's memory, felt like a deliberate cruelty. "You should not be here," she said, keeping her distance. "I own half the right to be here already, cousin, whether the court has confirmed it yet or not," Reginald said, though his voice lacked the smooth confidence she remembered from the reading of the will. "I came to speak with you plainly, without solicitors and dukes standing between us. This can end more gently than you are allowing it to become." "Gently," Eleanor repeated. "You mean quietly. You mean I should simply accept what you have taken, and thank you for the mercy of not humiliating me further in court." "I mean that continued fighting will cost you more than the estate alone," Reginald said. "Your reputation is already suffering for the Duke's involvement. Do you truly wish to drag this out further, only to lose in the end regardless? The codicil is sound. Whatever your Duke believes he has found will not hold beneath proper scrutiny." "Then you have nothing to fear from proper scrutiny," Eleanor said, "and no reason to stand in my father's garden threatening me instead of waiting calmly for the court to confirm what you claim is already certain." Something flickered across Reginald's face, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it fully. For a moment he looked less like a confident heir and more like a man cornered, aware that the walls he had built around his scheme were beginning to show their cracks to more than just himself. "You have made a grave mistake trusting him," Reginald said finally, his voice low. "Men like Renwick do not remain loyal to lost causes, Eleanor. When this becomes inconvenient for him, and it will, he will withdraw, and you will be left facing the consequences of this fight entirely alone. Consider carefully whether that is a risk worth taking, for a house that may not even be yours to lose much longer." He left without waiting for her reply, disappearing down the garden path with none of the composure he had carried at the reading of the will only weeks before. Eleanor stood beside her father's bench a long while after he had gone, turning his warning over in her mind, searching it for truth the way Julian had taught her to search a forged signature for the marks of a hand pretending to be something it was not. She did not believe him. She told herself this firmly, standing alone in the fading evening light, but some small, frightened part of her, the part that had watched her entire world upended in the space of a single afternoon, could not fully silence the doubt his words had planted. She wrote to Julian that night, describing the encounter in full, uncertain whether she hoped for reassurance, or simply needed to share the weight of it with someone who might understand. His reply arrived earlier than she expected, delivered by his own footman rather than the usual post, as though he had wanted her to have it the moment it was written. Reginald's desperation was proof enough of how close they had come to the truth, Julian wrote. He would not have risked confronting her directly, breaking his own careful composure, unless he believed the walls were closing in faster than he could rebuild them. Julian asked her to trust the evidence they had gathered, to trust Ellery's steady hand in countering the motion, and, if she was willing, to trust him as well, whatever doubts her cousin had tried to plant. Eleanor read the letter twice, then a third time, before finally setting it aside and allowing herself, for the first time since Reginald's visit to the garden, to breathe fully again. Whatever fear his words had stirred, she found it could not stand against the steadiness of Julian's own hand, against the growing evidence of a partnership built not on convenience, but on something far more solid than either of them had expected to find in the middle of a legal battle neither had chosen, but both now intended to see through to its end. The court date arrived 3 days later, closer now than it had ever felt before, and Eleanor Whitmore prepared to walk into that courtroom carrying not only her father's memory, but the fragile, hard-won hope that the truth, at last, might finally be strong enough to prevail. Mr. Ellery's response to Reginald's motion arrived at the courthouse 2 days before the scheduled hearing, and it landed, according to the clerk who delivered word of it to Julian, with considerably more force than Price had anticipated. The response laid out in careful and measured language the sequence of events that had led to Julian's involvement, beginning with the overheard conversation at the gathering, continuing through Fenwick's independent analysis, and ending with Edmund Fairfax's willingness to testify against his former employer. Nowhere in the account did personal interest appear as the origin of the investigation, only observation, followed by evidence, followed by a growing certainty that something had gone deeply wrong with the codicil presented at the reading of the will. Justice Harlan, a stern but fair-minded man known throughout London for his impatience with theatrics, denied Reginald's motion to disregard the evidence entirely, though he permitted the question of impartiality to be raised during the hearing itself, allowing Price the opportunity to challenge Julian's credibility in open court, should he choose to do so. It was, Ellery assured them, The best outcome they could have reasonably expected. The evidence would stand. But the battle over its meaning had only just begun. Reginald did not take the ruling quietly. Within a day, new whispers began moving through London, more pointed now than the vague gossip that had followed Julian's initial involvement. These whispers suggested something far uglier, that Julian's interest in Eleanor was not merely improper, but calculated. A duke seeking to secure influence over a vulnerable young woman's estate through manufactured sympathy rather than genuine principle. Eleanor heard the rumors secondhand, from a cousin of Lady Constance's who arrived at Ashford Hollow with poorly disguised concern, and far too much enthusiasm for repeating what she had heard at the previous evening's card party. Eleanor thanked her for the visit with as much composure as she could manage, and waited until the woman had gone before allowing herself to sit down, hands trembling slightly in her lap. "They believe he means to control the estate through me," she said quietly to Lady Constance once they were alone. "That his help was never about justice at all." "Rumors believe whatever is most entertaining to believe," Lady Constance said firmly. "You know the truth of the matter, so does he. That is what matters, not the idle chatter of women with nothing better to occupy their afternoons." Eleanor wanted to believe her aunt's confidence, but the rumors settled into her chest anyway, a quiet, persistent doubt she could not fully shake. She thought of Reginald's warning in the garden, the way he had predicted exactly this kind of attack before it arrived, and she wondered, despite everything, whether some part of his cruelty had been calculation rather than mere spite. She wrote to Julian that evening, laying out what she had heard without softening any of it, uncertain what response she expected but needing, regardless, to be honest with him about the cost his involvement continued to carry. His reply arrived the following morning, and it was longer than any letter he had sent her before, the careful formality of his earlier correspondence giving way, at last, to something more direct. The rumors did not surprise him, he wrote. Reginald had proven himself a man willing to use any weapon available, and reputation was a weapon that cost him nothing to wield while costing Julian a great deal to defend against. But Julian assured her that his involvement had never been, and would never become, a matter of controlling her estate or her future. If the court ruled in her favor, as he believed it eventually would, the estate and title would remain entirely hers, with no claim from him attached to it, implied or otherwise. He had not offered his help expecting anything in return, and he would not allow rumor to rewrite the truth of that intention now. He closed the letter with a line that Eleanor read many times over in the days that followed. Whatever the court decided, and whatever the gossip of London chose to believe, his regard for her had grown from something he had not anticipated and could no longer deny, and he hoped, once the trial had ended and her name was fully restored, that she might allow him to speak of it properly, without the shadow of a courtroom hanging over every word between them. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest for a long moment before setting it aside, feeling something warm settle in her chest despite the storm continuing to build around them both. That warmth did not last long. 2 days before the hearing, Reginald escalated his campaign further, arranging for a notice to appear discreetly in a widely read society paper, questioning not the evidence against him directly, but the character of the witness Julian intended to call. The notice suggested, without stating outright, that Edmund Fairfax had been dismissed from Price's employment for dishonesty, and implied that his testimony against his former employer might be motivated by bitterness rather than truth. Julian arrived at Ashford Hollow that same afternoon, his composure more strained than Eleanor had yet seen it. "They are trying to discredit him before he has even spoken a word in court," he said. "If Justice Harlan or the assembled crowd begin the hearing already doubting Edmund's honesty, the weight of his testimony will suffer, regardless of how truthfully he speaks." "Can we counter it?" Eleanor asked. "Ellery is already drafting a response," Julian said, "but printed doubt spreads faster than any correction ever manages to catch it. I fear the damage may already be done, at least in part." Eleanor watched him pace the length of the drawing room, frustration evident in every controlled movement, and found herself, despite the gravity of the situation, struck by how deeply he had come to care about an outcome that, by any reasonable measure, was not truly his burden to carry. She rose and crossed to where he stood, placing a steadying hand on his arm without fully considering the gesture until it was already made. "You have done more for my family than anyone had any right to expect," she said quietly. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, I will not forget what you have risked to bring us this far." Julian looked down at her hand resting against his sleeve, then met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I did not do this expecting gratitude, Eleanor. I told you that before, and I meant it. But I find that hearing it from you now means more than I anticipated it would." The moment stretched between them, fragile and uncertain, until the sound of Lady Constance's returning footsteps in the hallway drew them both quietly apart, propriety reasserting itself even as something unspoken had clearly shifted in the space between them. That evening, after Julian had gone, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor of her own. Edmund Fairfax arrived at Ashford Hollow just before dusk, his expression tight with worry, and asked to speak with her privately for only a few moments. "I saw the notice in the paper," he said, twisting his hat between his hands. "I understand if this changes what you and the Duke require of me. I do not wish to bring further trouble to your case by testifying now, if my presence will only give them more to attack." "Is what they printed true?" Eleanor asked gently. "No," Edmund said, meeting her eyes steadily, despite his evident nerves. "I was dismissed because I refused to help falsify a document, not because I was dishonest in my duties. But I understand that the truth matters little once a rumor has already taken root in people's minds." Eleanor thought of her own reputation, battered by whispers that bore no more truth than the ones now threatening Edmund's character, and found in that shared experience a resolve she had not expected to discover so easily. "Then we will simply have to prove the truth matters more than the rumor," she said. "I do not intend to let them silence you any more than I intend to let them silence me. My father trusted men of honest character, Mr. Fairfax. I intend to trust one now." Edmund left Ashford Hollow that evening with his resolve restored, and Eleanor watched him go feeling, for the first time in days, that perhaps Reginald's attacks, however sharp, were beginning to strengthen rather than weaken the alliance forming against him. 2 days remained before the hearing. Ellery worked through the nights preparing responses to every attack Reginald's side had launched, while Julian continued gathering whatever additional support the case might require. Eleanor spent her own remaining hours reviewing every detail of her father's true handwriting alongside Fenwick's written analysis, determined to understand the evidence as thoroughly as the men presenting it on her behalf. On the final evening before the trial, as Eleanor sat once more in her father's study surrounded by the same papers that had offered her no answers weeks before, a messenger arrived from the courthouse with unexpected news. Reginald's solicitor had filed a countersuit, seeking damages against Eleanor and Julian both, alleging that their accusations of forgery, should they fail to hold beneath scrutiny, constituted a deliberate and malicious attempt to damage his client's reputation and rightful claim. Eleanor stared at the notice for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what Reginald had chosen to risk in order to protect his scheme. A man confident in his innocence did not need to threaten his accusers with financial ruin. He threatened them only when the truth had grown too dangerous to face without one final, desperate attempt at intimidation. She sent word to Julian immediately, and his reply arrived within the hour, steady as always despite the escalating stakes. "Let him file whatever suits he wishes," Julian wrote. "A countersuit built on the assumption that our evidence will fail is no threat at all to those who know it will not." Eleanor read the words twice, drew a slow breath, and allowed herself, at last, to believe him. Sleep proved impossible that night. Eleanor lay awake long after the candles had burned down, listening to the quiet sounds of the house around her, the same house she had grown up believing would always belong to her family, the same house Reginald now threatened to strip from her along with everything else her father had built. She rose before dawn and walked once more through the gardens, past the roses her father had planted, past the bench where Reginald had confronted her only days before. The morning air was cold and clean, and she found, standing there in the pale early light, that her fear had settled into something quieter and more resolute overnight. Fear had driven her in the first days after the will was read. It would not drive her today. Lady Constance found her there as the sun began to rise properly over the hills, and the two women stood together in silence for a long moment, before her aunt finally spoke. "Your father would be proud of how you have handled all of this," she said, "not simply for fighting, but for how carefully you have chosen your allies, and how steadily you have carried yourself despite everything thrown against you." "I could not have done any of it without Julian," Eleanor admitted. "No," Lady Constance agreed, "but do not mistake his help for the whole of your strength, Eleanor. He recognized in you something worth defending. That recognition required a woman strong enough to be worth defending in the first place." Eleanor considered her aunt's words as they walked back toward the house together, turning them over the way she had once turned over the forged codicil, searching for their full meaning. She had spent the past weeks feeling, at times, as though she were merely a passenger in her own case, carried along by Julian's investigation and Ellery's careful arguments. But her aunt was right. She had made the choice to fight from the very first moment, had searched her father's papers alone before Julian ever appeared, had trusted her own instincts about the forged signature before anyone confirmed them. Whatever help she had received since, the fight had always, at its heart, belonged to her. A note arrived from Julian shortly after breakfast, brief but warm, wishing her steadiness for the day ahead and reminding her that Ellery, Fenwick, and Edmund would all stand ready to speak the truth as clearly as the court would allow. He would arrive at the courthouse separately, he wrote, to avoid feeding the rumors further before the hearing even began, though he promised he would be present the moment proceedings opened. Eleanor dressed carefully that morning, choosing a plain but dignified gown that had belonged to her mother, feeling, as she fastened the final buttons, as though she were arming herself for battle, in the only way available to a woman denied a sword or a seat among the barristers. Lady Constance helped arrange her hair in silence, and when they finally stepped into the waiting carriage, neither woman spoke, the weight of the coming hours settling heavily over them both. The ride to the courthouse felt longer than Eleanor remembered any journey feeling before, each turn of the wheels bringing her closer to a moment that would decide, in a matter of hours, whether she would remain Eleanor Whitmore of Ashford Hollow, or simply Eleanor Whitmore, a woman without a name worth defending. She thought of her father as the courthouse finally came into view, its gray stone walls stern and unforgiving against the morning sky. She thought of his quiet mornings in the garden, his steady insistence that she carried the family's name in her hands like a candle flame that must never be allowed to go out. Whatever happened within those walls today, she intended to carry that flame forward, however the court ultimately ruled, refusing to let Reginald's greed be the thing that finally extinguished it. The carriage came to a stop. Lady Constance squeezed her hand once, firmly, before the footman opened the door. "Whatever comes," her aunt said, "you have already proven yourself worthy of everything your father built. Do not forget that, no matter what is said inside those walls today." Eleanor stepped down from the carriage, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the courthouse doors with her head held high, ready, at last, to face whatever Reginald and Price still intended to throw against her. The courtroom was already crowded by the time Eleanor arrived, filled with a mixture of legal observers, curious society members drawn by weeks of gossip, and a handful of servants from Ashford Hollow who had come, quietly and without invitation, to show their support. Reginald sat near the front beside Price, his composure fully restored for the occasion, dressed in his finest coat, every inch the confident air he had been playing since the reading of the will. He did not look at Eleanor as she took her seat, though she noticed the slight tightening around his eyes when Julian entered the courtroom moments later and crossed to sit near Ellery on the opposite side. Justice Harlan entered promptly, his expression giving away nothing of how he might rule, and the room fell silent as he called the proceedings to order. Price spoke first, laying out Reginald's claim with the same smooth confidence he had shown at the original reading of the will, presenting the codicil once more as genuine, describing the late Baron's supposed final wishes with practiced sincerity. He reminded the court more than once of the countersuit filed against Eleanor and Julian, suggesting that their accusations, born of what he called improper personal interest, threatened to damage a grieving family's rightful inheritance through baseless slander. Eleanor felt her hands tighten in her lap as she listened, but she kept her expression steady, remembering her aunt's words from that morning. She had already proven herself worthy of the fight. She would not let Price's careful performance shake that resolve now. When Ellery rose to present their case, he began not with accusations, but with Fenwick's written analysis, calling the document examiner himself to the stand to explain his findings in careful, measured detail. Fenwick spoke with the quiet authority of 30 years' experience, walking the court through the inconsistencies in pressure and pacing that separated the forged signature from the late Baron's genuine hand, presenting comparison after comparison, until even the most skeptical faces in the gallery began to shift with growing doubt. Price cross-examined him at length, attempting to suggest that natural variation in handwriting could account for the discrepancies Fenwick described. He pressed the examiner on his methods, questioned his experience, even suggested at one point that Fenwick's opinion had been purchased through the Duke's influence rather than arrived at through honest analysis. Fenwick answered each accusation without rising to anger, his calm growing, if anything, more pronounced the harder Price pushed against it. "I have examined documents for the courts of this city for 30 years, Mr. Price," Fenwick said evenly. "My reputation rests entirely on the accuracy of my findings, not on the generosity of whoever happens to request them. If you believe my analysis is mistaken, I invite you to bring forward your own examiner to challenge it directly, rather than questioning my character in its absence." Price had no such examiner to call, a fact that did not escape the notice of anyone watching closely, including Justice Harlan, whose expression had grown steadily more skeptical throughout the exchange. He held his ground with calm precision, refusing to be shaken by Price's increasingly pointed questions. Handwriting varies, Fenwick agreed, but it varies naturally, in ways that reflect the writer's fatigue and haste. This signature shows the opposite. It shows unnatural consistency, the mark of a hand copying a model slowly and deliberately, rather than writing freely, as the Baron's own correspondence clearly does throughout every other document I examined. The gallery murmured at this, and Justice Harlan called for order, though Eleanor could see, even from her seat, that the magistrate's expression had grown considerably more attentive than it had been during Price's opening remarks. Next, Ellery called Edmund Fairfax to the stand, and Eleanor watched Reginald's composure crack, just slightly, at the sight of him. Price leaned toward Reginald and whispered something urgent, but there was little either man could do now beyond watch, as Edmund took his oath and began to speak. He described his time working in Price's office with quiet, unshakable honesty, explaining exactly what he had witnessed in the weeks before Eleanor's father's death, and exactly why he had been dismissed for refusing to participate in it. He did not exaggerate, he did not embellish, he simply told the truth, plainly and clearly, and the simplicity of his account carried more weight in the courtroom than any dramatic accusation could have managed. Price attempted to discredit him during cross-examination, raising the same insinuations about dishonesty that had appeared in the society paper days before, but Edmund answered each question with the same steady calm, refusing to be baited into anger or defensiveness. By the time Price finally sat down, the doubt he had hoped to plant seemed, if anything, to have withered rather than taken root. During the brief pause while the clerk prepared the next portion of the proceedings, Eleanor allowed herself a glance toward Reginald, and what she saw surprised her. Gone was the composed, confident cousin who had presented the codicil at the reading of the will. In his place sat a man whose hands would not remain still, whose eyes kept flicking toward the courtroom doors, as though he were calculating, even now, whether escape remained possible. Price leaned close to whisper something urgent, and Reginald shook his head sharply, a small, private argument playing out between them in the space of a few tense seconds. Eleanor could not hear what was said, but she recognized the shape of it well enough. Two men who had built their entire scheme on confidence now found that confidence crumbling in full view of the very society they had hoped to impress with their victory. Ellery called one final witness before the recess, a neighboring landholder who had known Eleanor's father for over 20 years and could speak to his character and habits regarding estate matters. The man's testimony was brief but effective, describing a baron who discussed every significant decision openly with his daughter, who had spoken with pride, on more than one occasion, of Eleanor's capability and the trust he placed in her judgment. He told me himself, not 2 months before his death, the landholder said, that Ashford Hollow would remain in good hands, regardless of what the law allowed a daughter to inherit directly. He was already exploring ways to secure her future through trusts and arrangements that would honor her position, whatever formal title the law recognized. Does that sound to any of you like a man planning to hand everything to a nephew he rarely spoke to? The gallery murmured again, and Eleanor felt tears threaten for an entirely different reason than fear. The simple, overwhelming relief of hearing her father's love for her, spoken aloud in a room that had, until this moment, treated her almost as an afterthought in the fight over his legacy. Still, Justice Harlan did not rule immediately. He called for a brief recess to consider the evidence presented, and Eleanor found herself pacing the corridor outside the courtroom, her nerves stretched thin despite the strength of the testimony she had just witnessed. Julian found her there, away from the gathered crowd, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the quiet hallway, while the fate of everything Eleanor's father had built hung suspended, waiting for a magistrate's judgment. Fenwick and Edmund spoke well, Julian said finally. Harlan is a careful man. He will not rule hastily on something this consequential. And if he rules against us anyway? Eleanor asked, voicing the fear she had carried since the reading of the will, the one she had never quite managed to silence no matter how strong the evidence against Reginald had grown. Then we will find another path forward, Julian said. I did not begin this fight expecting an easy victory, Eleanor, and I do not intend to abandon you simply because the first attempt falls short, but I do not believe it will. The evidence stands on its own strength today, exactly as Ellery promised it would. Before Eleanor could answer, a clerk appeared at the end of the corridor, calling the court back into session. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself, and followed Julian back into the crowded room. What happened next, Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life as the moment everything finally shifted. Justice Harlan, rather than delivering his ruling immediately, called for one final matter to be addressed before proceedings concluded. He turned his attention directly to Reginald, his expression sharp and unforgiving, in a way it had not been throughout the earlier testimony. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I find myself troubled by an inconsistency in the timeline you have presented. Your solicitor claims this codicil was discovered among the late Baron's private papers only after his death, yet Mr. Fairfax has testified, under oath, that he witnessed preparations for a document matching this description several weeks before the Baron passed. I would like you to explain this discrepancy directly, in your own words, before I render judgment." The courtroom fell utterly silent. Reginald rose slowly, his earlier confidence visibly faltering under the weight of the magistrate's direct scrutiny. He glanced toward Price, who offered no help, his own composure finally beginning to crack beneath the accumulated weight of the morning's testimony. "I was not personally involved in the document's preparation," Reginald said carefully, choosing his words with obvious strain. "Mr. Price handled the legal matters on my behalf. I cannot speak to the precise timeline of its discovery." "Convenient," Justice Harlan said, his tone leaving little doubt as to what he thought of the answer. "Mr. Price, perhaps you would care to clarify, given that your client seems unable to do so himself." Price rose, and for the first time since Eleanor had met him, his careful composure abandoned him entirely. He stammered through an explanation that satisfied no one in the room, contradicting details he had presented earlier in the proceedings, growing more tangled with each attempted correction. It was in the middle of this faltering explanation that Julian rose from his seat, unbidden, and asked the court's permission to address one final piece of evidence he had not yet formally presented. Justice Harlan, visibly intrigued despite the irregularity of the request, granted him leave to speak. Julian crossed to stand before the bench, and Eleanor watched him with her heart pounding, uncertain what he intended to reveal that had not already been laid before the court. "Your Honor," he began, "in the course of this investigation, I obtained, through entirely legitimate means, a ledger from Mr. Price's own office, recording the dates and hours billed to Mr. Whitmore in the weeks before the late Baron's death. I present it now, not to embarrass the court with unnecessary detail, but because it corroborates precisely what Mr. Fairfax has already testified. The ledger shows extensive hours billed for document preparation nearly a month before the Baron's passing, hours far exceeding what any ordinary estate matter would require, and entirely inconsistent with the story presented by Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Price today." He handed the ledger to the clerk, who carried it forward to the bench. Justice Harlan reviewed it in silence for a long moment, the courtroom holding its collective breath, before finally setting it down with an expression that left no doubt as to his conclusion. "I have heard enough," he said. "The evidence before this court, taken as a whole, leaves no reasonable doubt that the codicil presented at the reading of the late Baron's will was forged, prepared in advance of his death and falsely attributed to his own hand. I find in favor of Miss Eleanor Whitmore, and direct that the estate and title of Ashford Hollow remain with her, as originally intended under her father's true and unaltered will." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some scandalized, some relieved, and Eleanor sat frozen for a moment, the words taking longer to fully land than she expected. Beside her, Lady Constance gripped her hand tightly, tears already gathering in her eyes. Justice Harlan was not finished. He turned his attention to Price, his expression hardening further. "Given the evidence of deliberate forgery presented today, I am referring this matter to the appropriate authorities for further investigation into fraud. Mr. Price, I would advise you to secure legal counsel of your own before this proceeding concludes." Price's face had gone pale, all his earlier confidence entirely stripped away. Reginald sat beside him, staring straight ahead, the full weight of his failed scheme finally settling over him in front of the very courtroom he had once believed would secure his victory. Eleanor turned, finally, to find Julian watching her, and the look on his face, relief and warmth and something far deeper than either, undid the last of her careful composure. She rose from her seat, crossed the small distance between them without regard for propriety or the watching crowd, and found herself, for the first time since her father's death, able to breathe fully, without the weight of fear pressing down against every corner of her chest. "You spoke for me," she said quietly, her voice thick with everything she had carried through the past weeks. "When I could not speak for myself, you stood in that courtroom and spoke for me." "I told you I would not let this fail," Julian said, his own composure softened by the same emotion she felt rising in her own chest. "I meant every word of it, Eleanor, every part." Around them, the courtroom continued to murmur and shift, Reginald being led aside by his own solicitor for a hurried, tense conversation, Price already gathering his papers with shaking hands. But for a moment, none of it touched Eleanor at all. She stood in the middle of the chaos, her name and her home finally restored, and allowed herself, at last, to feel something she had not dared to feel since the reading of the will. Hope, fully realized, standing steady beside her in the shape of a duke who had chosen, against every expectation, to fight for a stranger's cause, simply because it was right. Lady Constance appeared beside them a moment later, her composure finally breaking entirely as she pulled Eleanor into a fierce embrace, murmuring something about her brother, Eleanor's father, and how proud he would have been to see this moment. Eleanor held onto her aunt tightly, letting the tears fall freely now that the fear that had suppressed them for weeks had finally released its grip. Across the room, Edmund Fairfax stood quietly near the door, watching the scene with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Eleanor caught his eye and crossed to him before he could slip away unnoticed. "You risked everything to speak the truth today," she said. "I will not forget it, Mr. Fairfax, and neither, I suspect, will the Duke." "I did what your father's kindness deserved," Edmund said simply. "I am glad it was enough." Justice Harlan called the room back to brief order to finalize the procedural details of his ruling, instructing Ellery and the court clerk to prepare the necessary documents restoring Ashford Hollow and its title fully to Eleanor's name, effective immediately upon the court's formal record. He noted, with a pointed glance toward Price, that the referral for fraud investigation would proceed separately, and that both Reginald and Price should expect further inquiry into the matter in the days ahead. Reginald did not look at Eleanor as he was finally led from the courtroom by his own solicitor, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost far more than he had ever anticipated risking. Whatever satisfaction Eleanor might once have imagined feeling at his downfall, she found instead only a quiet, tired relief that the fight, at last, was finally over. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun had broken through the gray clouds that had hung over London all morning, and Eleanor stood on the stone steps beside Julian, Lady Constance, and the small gathering of Ashford Hollow servants who had come to witness the proceedings, feeling, for the first time in weeks, as though the ground beneath her had finally settled into something solid and certain. "What happens now?" she asked Julian quietly, watching the crowd begin to disperse around them. "Now," Julian said, "you go home, to Ashford Hollow, which remains entirely yours, exactly as it always should have been." He paused, studying her face with an expression that carried both relief and something gentler still. "And perhaps, when you are ready, and this ordeal has had time to properly settle, you might allow me to call on you again, not as a solicitor's ally or a courtroom witness, but simply as myself." Eleanor smiled, the first full, unguarded smile she had allowed herself since the reading of the will. "I believe I would like that very much, Your Grace." The carriage ride home felt entirely different from the tense journey that had carried her to the courthouse that morning. The weight of dread replaced now by something lighter, something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of a life she had feared she might never be allowed to keep. News of the ruling spread through London faster than any of the rumors that had preceded it, and within days, the story of the forged codicil had become the very topic Eleanor once feared it would, discussed in every drawing room and card party across the city, though now for reasons entirely different from what she had dreaded weeks before. The same women who had once whispered about impropriety now spoke of Eleanor with something closer to admiration, praising her quiet strength throughout the ordeal, and the same voices that had once questioned Julian's motives now spoke of him as a man of remarkable principle, willing to risk his own reputation in defense of the truth. Eleanor found the reversal almost dizzying, the same society that had been so eager to condemn her, now equally eager to celebrate her, though she understood well enough that both reactions said more about the fickle nature of gossip than about any real change in the people repeating it. Mr. Price's fraud investigation proceeded swiftly once the court's referral reached the appropriate authorities. Additional evidence emerged in the following weeks, including testimony from 2 other former clients who had grown suspicious of similar irregularities in his handling of their own estate matters, and within a month, Price's practice had been formally dissolved, his license to practice law revoked entirely. Reginald fared little better. Stripped of the estate he had schemed to claim, and facing his own scrutiny for his role in the forgery, he withdrew from London society entirely, retreating to a distant property inherited from his mother's side of the family, a much smaller and far less prestigious holding than Ashford Hollow had ever been. Eleanor heard, second-hand and much later, that he had grown increasingly isolated in the years that followed, his reputation too damaged to fully recover among the circles that had once respected the Whitmore name. Eleanor did not spend much time dwelling on his fate. She found, in the weeks following the ruling, that she had far more pressing matters to occupy her attention, chief among them the slow, careful process of restoring Ashford Hollow to the life it had known before her father's death, and the equally slow, equally careful process of allowing herself to trust in the happiness that had begun, tentatively, to bloom between herself and Julian. He called on her formally 2 weeks after the ruling. Once enough time had passed that propriety no longer demanded quite so much caution between them. He arrived at Ashford Hollow on a bright afternoon, and this time, when Lady Constance offered to chaperone from her usual seat near the window, there was a knowing warmth in her expression that had not been present during those earlier, more anxious visits. They walked the gardens together, past the roses her father had planted, past the bench where Reginald had once tried to frighten her with warnings that had proven, in the end, entirely hollow. Julian spoke of small things at first: the weather, the state of his own estate's affairs, the quiet satisfaction of watching Edmund Fairfax secure a respectable new position with Julian's own recommendation attached to it. But Eleanor could see, in the careful way he chose his words, that something larger waited beneath the surface of their conversation. "I told you once," Julian said finally, as they reached the bench and paused beneath the shade of an old oak tree, "that I hoped, once this ordeal had ended, you might allow me to speak of my regard for you properly. I find that the time for careful hoping has passed, Eleanor, and the time for honesty has finally arrived." Eleanor's heart quickened, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I did not expect, when I first noticed your cousin's suspicious behavior at that gathering weeks ago, that the investigation which followed would change the course of my own life as thoroughly as it changed yours," Julian said. "I have spent most of my years guarding myself carefully against exactly this kind of feeling, believing my position left little room for anything so uncertain as genuine affection. But I find, standing here with you now, that I no longer wish to guard against it at all. I love you, Eleanor Whitmore, not for the estate you fought so hard to keep, not for the drama of the courtroom that brought us together, but for the woman I have watched face every threat against her, with more courage than most men I have known could ever manage to summon." Eleanor felt tears rise, though these carried none of the grief that had marked so many of her tears in recent weeks. "I did not expect to find love in the middle of losing everything," she said softly, "but I find that I love you as well, Julian. Not for the title you hold, or the influence that helped save my home, but for the steadiness you brought into the middle of my worst fear, and the way you never once made me feel as though I were merely a cause to be championed rather than a person worth knowing." Julian reached for her hand, holding it gently, his expression carrying a warmth she had rarely seen from him during the careful formality of their earlier meetings. "Then I would ask you, Eleanor, if you would consider allowing me to court you properly, without courtrooms or forged documents standing between us, simply as two people who have found, against every unlikely circumstance, something worth building together." "I would like that very much," Eleanor said, and the smile that followed felt like the first truly unguarded joy she had allowed herself since long before her father's death. A month after the ruling, Lady Constance insisted that Eleanor accept an invitation to a grand ball hosted by one of London's most prominent families, arguing that the time had come for Eleanor to reclaim her place in society openly, rather than allowing the memory of the trial to keep her quietly hidden away at Ashford Hollow. Eleanor hesitated, uncertain whether she was ready to face a room full of the same people who had so eagerly repeated every rumor against her only weeks before, but Lady Constance's insistence, as usual, proved impossible to refuse entirely. The evening began with the same uneasy awareness Eleanor had grown accustomed to since the reading of the will, conversations quieting slightly as she entered, eyes following her across the crowded ballroom. But the quality of the attention had shifted entirely from what she remembered. Where once she had felt the weight of suspicion and pity, she now felt something closer to genuine curiosity and respect. Women approaching to offer their congratulations on the court's ruling, men nodding to her with newfound deference they had not shown when her position seemed uncertain. Julian arrived partway through the evening, and the moment he crossed the room to greet her, Eleanor felt the last of her earlier nervousness dissolve entirely. They danced together twice, a scandal by the stricter standards of the previous season, though no one in the room seemed inclined to comment on it, beyond a few knowing smiles exchanged between older matrons who had clearly already guessed at the direction their courtship was heading. It was during that same ball that Eleanor overheard, quite by accident, two women discussing Reginald's fate with the same casual cruelty that had once been directed at her own reputation. He had reportedly attempted to secure a position within a distant relative's household, only to be quietly turned away once word of the fraud investigation reached them. Whatever sympathy Eleanor might once have felt for her cousin, family bond stretched thin as it was, had long since been replaced by a simple, tired relief that his schemes could no longer touch her or Ashford Hollow ever again. She mentioned the conversation to Julian later that evening, as they stood together near the terrace doors away from the thickest part of the crowd. "I do not know whether I should feel triumphant or simply sad," she admitted. "He was family once, whatever he became afterward." "You are allowed to feel both," Julian said gently. "Justice and sorrow are not always opposites, Eleanor. Sometimes the truth simply costs something, even when it is entirely deserved." She thought about his words often in the weeks that followed, finding in them a kind of permission she had not realized she needed, to grieve the family bond that Reginald's greed had destroyed, even while remaining firmly grateful that his scheme had ultimately failed. Their courtship, once properly begun, unfolded with none of the frantic urgency that had marked the weeks of the trial. Julian called regularly, always with Lady Constance's watchful but increasingly approving presence nearby, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply enjoying the quiet pleasure of another person's company, without the weight of crisis pressing down around every conversation. They spoke of everything during those visits: her father's memory, the small details of running an estate that she was only now beginning to fully understand as its rightful mistress, Julian's own family history, and the difficult years his father had spent defending their title against a similar scheme decades before. Eleanor came to understand, more fully with each visit, why Julian had recognized the shape of her troubles so quickly, and why he had felt compelled to act rather than simply observe from a comfortable distance. 3 months after the ruling, Julian arranged a small gathering at his own estate, ostensibly a simple dinner among close acquaintances, though Eleanor suspected, from the moment she arrived, that something more significant waited beneath the surface of the evening's careful arrangements. She was proven right after dinner, when Julian led her out onto the terrace overlooking his own gardens, the evening air cool and fragrant with late summer blooms. He did not delay with lengthy preamble, kneeling instead with a small velvet box held carefully in one hand, his composure, for once, entirely abandoned in favor of open, unguarded emotion. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, "I have spent my life believing duty and affection rarely traveled the same path. You have proven me wrong in every possible way. I love you more fully than I believed myself capable of loving anyone, and I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would agree to become my wife." Eleanor did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with joy rather than the fear that had colored so much of the past months. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." He rose and drew her into an embrace, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, simply standing together beneath the evening sky, the terrible uncertainty of the past months finally giving way to something steady and certain and entirely their own. In the months leading up to the wedding, Eleanor threw herself fully into the work of restoring Ashford Hollow to the thriving estate it had been under her father's careful management. She reviewed every ledger personally, met with each tenant to understand their concerns, and made decisions with a confidence that surprised even Lady Constance, who had known her as a quiet, dutiful daughter far more often than as the capable mistress she was quickly becoming. She invited Edmund Fairfax to visit Ashford Hollow that autumn, wanting to properly thank him once more for the risk he had taken on her behalf. She found him settled comfortably into his new position, secured through Julian's recommendation, and grateful beyond measure for the fresh start it had provided. "Your father always said a kindness returns to you eventually," Edmund told her, standing once more in the gardens where he had first pledged his testimony. "I did not expect it to return quite so fully, but I am glad it did." Fenwick, too, sent his congratulations upon hearing news of the engagement, along with a note expressing his satisfaction that the truth, once properly examined, had prevailed exactly as the evidence demanded. Eleanor kept his letter alongside Julian's earliest correspondence, a small collection of honest voices that had helped carry her through the darkest weeks of her life. As winter gave way to spring, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Lady Constance took charge of many of the arrangements with obvious delight, though she consulted Eleanor on every detail, determined that the day should reflect Eleanor's own wishes rather than society's expectations of how a duchess ought to be married. Eleanor chose simplicity over extravagance wherever possible, wanting the day to honor her father's memory as much as it celebrated her future with Julian. Their wedding took place at Ashford Hollow itself, in the same gardens where Eleanor's father had once walked with her as a child, where Reginald had tried and failed to frighten her into surrender, where Julian had first declared the full truth of his feelings beneath the shade of the old oak tree. Lady Constance stood proudly at Eleanor's side throughout the ceremony, and the same society that had once whispered so cruelly about impropriety now gathered to celebrate a match that had, by then, become something of a legend among London's drawing rooms, a story of forgery exposed, justice delivered, and love found in the most unexpected of circumstances. Eleanor stood before the assembled guests as Julian's wife, Duchess of Renwick, and mistress of Ashford Hollow in her own right. A title and a home that were entirely, undeniably hers, secured not through inheritance alone, but through her own courage, her own persistence, and the steady partnership of a man who had chosen, against every expectation, to stand and speak for her when she needed it most. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply felt, vows spoken beneath the same sky that had witnessed both the worst and the best of the past year, surrounded by the roses her father had planted so many years before. When Justice Harlan himself appeared among the guests, having grown genuinely fond of the case that had crossed his bench, Eleanor felt a quiet, grateful satisfaction that even the man who had delivered her justice had come to witness the happiness that followed it. Lady Constance wept openly throughout the ceremony, though she insisted afterward that the tears were entirely those of joy, and Eleanor believed her without hesitation, recognizing in her aunt's emotion the same fierce love that had carried them both through every difficult moment since her father's death. As the celebration continued long into the evening, Eleanor found a quiet moment to slip away toward the old stone bench in the garden, wanting a brief moment of stillness amid the joyful chaos of the day. Julian found her there within minutes, settling beside her with the easy familiarity of a man who had long since learned to read her moods without needing to ask. "Regretting the crowd already?" he asked, a teasing warmth in his voice that had become far more common since the trial's conclusion. "Never that," Eleanor said, leaning against his shoulder. "I simply wanted a moment to remember him, my father. I think he would have liked you very much, Julian. He always said he wanted someone steady for me, someone who would stand beside me, rather than in front of me." "Then I hope I have proven myself worthy of that wish," Julian said quietly. "You have," Eleanor said. "More than worthy." She thought often, in the years that followed, of her father's words about carrying the family name like a candle flame through a dark house. She understood now, standing secure in the life she had fought so hard to keep, that she had not only protected that flame through the darkest days of her life, but had found, in the process, someone willing to shelter it alongside her, for as long as they both should live. Ashford Hollow flourished under their combined care in the years that followed, its gardens as carefully tended as ever, its halls filled once more with the warmth and laughter that had defined it during Eleanor's childhood. And whenever visitors asked about the portrait of the old baron that still hung proudly in the entrance hall, Eleanor would tell them, with quiet pride, the story of a daughter who refused to lose her family's name, and the duke who had walked into a courtroom and spoken for her when she needed it most. 5 years passed, and Ashford Hollow had grown into something even Eleanor's father might not have fully imagined. A thriving estate known throughout the county not only for its careful management, but for the warmth with which its mistress and master welcomed tenants and neighbors alike into its halls. Eleanor stood now in the same garden where so much of her story had unfolded, watching her eldest daughter chase after a small dog across the lawn, while her younger son sat quietly beside Lady Constance, listening with rapt attention as his great-aunt told him, for what must have been the 100th time, the story of the wicked cousin who had tried to steal his mother's home, and the brave duke who had stopped him. "You embellish more each time you tell it," Julian said, coming to stand beside Eleanor with the same quiet ease that had defined their marriage from its very first days. "Soon Reginald will have arrived at the courthouse wielding a sword, and I will have defeated him in single combat rather than a rather less dramatic exchange of ledgers and testimony." "Children prefer swords to ledgers," Eleanor said, laughing. "I cannot fault her for the improvement." They had settled over the years into a partnership that continued to surprise Eleanor with its steadiness, the same quiet strength that had first drawn her to Julian in the middle of her darkest days, now woven into the fabric of everyday life, present in small moments far more often than grand ones. He still rose before dawn most mornings, a habit she suspected he had carried since his own difficult years defending his father's title, and she had come to cherish the quiet hours they often spent together in the study before the household fully woke, discussing estate matters, family news, or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. Word had reached them, some years back, that Reginald had passed quietly at his mother's smaller property, having never fully recovered his standing in society after the scandal of the forged codicil. Eleanor had grieved the news in her own private way, mourning not the man he had become, but the cousin she remembered from childhood, before greed had reshaped him into someone she no longer recognized. Julian had held her through that grief without judgment, understanding, as he always seemed to, the complicated tangle of emotions that family betrayal left behind, long after justice had been served. Mr. Price, stripped of his license and facing the consequences of his fraud, had left London entirely, and Eleanor had heard little of him since, content to let that chapter of her story remain firmly closed. Edmund Fairfax, by contrast, had risen steadily in his new position, eventually opening a small practice of his own, one known throughout London for its scrupulous honesty, a reputation he guarded fiercely, having learned firsthand the cost of working alongside men who valued profit over principle. Fenwick had continued his work as a document examiner for another decade before retiring, and Eleanor made a point of sending him a letter each year on the anniversary of the ruling, thanking him once more for the careful, patient expertise that had helped save her family's name. He always replied with the same brief, characteristically precise note, expressing his pleasure at having played some small part in seeing justice properly served. Justice Harland, too, remained a welcome presence in their lives, attending the christening of both of Eleanor and Julian's children, and often remarking, with dry good humor, that theirs remained the most memorable case of his long career on the bench, not merely for the drama of the forgery itself, but for the rare and genuine happiness that had grown from its resolution. Lady Constance had grown older but no less sharp in the years since the trial, remaining a constant and beloved presence at Ashford Hollow, refusing every gentle suggestion from Eleanor that she might prefer a quieter life of her own, and leave you to raise these children without proper guidance? She had said more than once, with the same fierce affection that had carried Eleanor through the darkest weeks of her father's death. I think not. Eleanor had long since stopped arguing the point, grateful beyond measure for her aunt's continued presence in a house that had once felt so precarious, and now felt more solid, more permanently theirs, with each passing year. Julian's own mother, who had been cautiously reserved toward Eleanor in the early days of their courtship, had come, over time, to regard her daughter-in-law with genuine warmth, often remarking that she had never seen her son as settled and content as he had become since the trial that first brought them together. She visited Ashford Hollow frequently, delighting in her grandchildren, and had once confided to Eleanor, over tea in the garden, that she believed her son had needed exactly the kind of quiet courage Eleanor possessed, a steadiness that matched his own, rather than a fragile dependence that might have left him feeling burdened rather than balanced. The estate itself had prospered under their combined stewardship, the tenant farms yielding steady harvests, the household accounts kept with the same careful attention Eleanor had once poured into searching her father's ledgers for evidence of forgery. She had never forgotten the lesson those desperate weeks had taught her, that knowledge and preparation were their own form of protection, and she made certain every important document concerning Ashford Hollow was recorded, witnessed and secured well beyond any possibility of the kind of deception that had once nearly destroyed everything her father had built. Her elder daughter, now old enough to ask increasingly detailed questions about the family's history, had recently begun accompanying Eleanor on her rounds through the estate's ledgers and tenant meetings, watching with the same quiet attentiveness Eleanor herself had once shown her own father. Eleanor found a particular joy in these mornings together, recognizing in her daughter's careful questions the same instinct for justice and fairness that had carried her own fight against Reginald so many years before. "Will I be mistress of Ashford Hollow one day?" her daughter had asked recently, looking up from the ledger they were reviewing together with wide, curious eyes. "If that is what you wish, yes," Eleanor had told her honestly, "and no one, I promise you, will ever be permitted to take it from you unfairly. Your father and I will make certain of that, long before the question ever needs to be tested." Ashford Hollow's gardens had expanded over the years, new roses planted alongside the ones Eleanor's father had first cultivated, a living record of the family's continued growth, layered carefully atop its roots. Eleanor often walked those gardens in the early evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with Julian, sometimes trailing children eager to hear yet another telling of the story that had shaped their family's history. She thought, on quiet evenings like this one, of the frightened young woman who had stood in this very garden years before, uncertain whether she would be permitted to keep anything her father had built, uncertain whether the truth alone would ever prove strong enough against a determined liar's confidence. She had learned, in the years since, that truth rarely won on its own merit alone. It required people willing to fight for it, to risk their own comfort and reputation in its defense, to stand quietly beside someone in danger of losing everything, and refuse to let them face that danger alone. She had been fortunate enough to find such people, in Julian, in Edmund, in Fenwick, in her own steadfast aunt, and she made certain, in raising her own children, that they understood this lesson as clearly as she had come to understand it herself. Names and titles mattered less, in the end, than the character of the people who carried them, and the willingness to stand firmly on the side of truth, however difficult or costly that stance might prove to be. As the sun began to set over Ashford Hollow that evening, casting long golden light across the gardens her father had loved so dearly, Eleanor felt Julian's hand find hers, the same steady grip that had carried her through the darkest weeks of her life, now simply a comfortable, familiar part of every ordinary evening they shared together. "Any regrets?" he asked, watching their children play across the lawn as the light grew softer around them. Eleanor considered the question honestly, thinking back over every difficult turn the past years had carried her through. The grief of losing her father, the fear of losing everything he had built, the long weeks of uncertain investigation, the courtroom battle that had finally restored what was rightfully hers. "None," she said finally. "Every difficult moment led me here, to this garden, to this family, to you. I would not trade any of it, however painful it felt at the time." Julian pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, and together they watched their children continue their play in the fading evening light, the flame of the Whitmore name, once threatened with extinction, now burning steadily onward, carried forward not merely in a title or an estate, but in the love and loyalty that had grown, against every unlikely circumstance, from the ashes of near ruin, into something lasting, and entirely their own. Their younger son, still too young to fully grasp the significance of the family's history, nonetheless loved the story Lady Constance told him each evening, insisting on hearing it again and again, until the details had worn as smooth and familiar as the stones of the old garden bench where so much of it had unfolded. Eleanor sometimes wondered what her father would make of it all, this small, thriving family gathered in the gardens he had loved so dearly, the estate he had built now flourishing into a second generation he had never lived to see. She liked to believe he would have been proud, not merely of the title and land she had managed to protect, but of the choices that had carried her through the fight to keep them, the courage to search for truth when despair would have been so much easier, the willingness to trust an unlikely ally when caution might have kept her safer but far more alone. She had learned in the process that a family's name was never truly secured by law or title alone. It was secured by the people willing to defend it, and by the love that made such defense worth the cost. As twilight settled fully over Ashford Hollow, Julian gathered their children for the walk back toward the house, Lady Constance following behind with her usual brisk, affectionate commentary on the evening's events. Eleanor lingered a moment longer in the garden, standing beside the old stone bench, her fingers brushing lightly against the roses her father had planted so many years before. "We kept it," she said quietly, "to no one but the memory of him. Just as you always believed I would." The evening breeze stirred gently through the garden, carrying with it the scent of roses and the distant, joyful sound of her children's laughter drifting back from the house. Eleanor smiled, turned from the bench, and followed her family home, carrying with her, as she always would, the steady, unbroken flame of a name that had nearly been lost, and had instead become the foundation of everything she now held dear. Ashford Hollow stood as it always had, a quiet testament to a family's endurance, its gardens blooming each spring exactly as they had for generations, its halls filled once more with laughter and warmth, and its name, at last and forever, secure.